Today we will be exploring intervals on the C major scale using the staff and the piano. But first, what is an interval? An interval is the relationship between two notes, not 3 or 4, and definitely not 5. Only between two notes. Just like people, intervals have names in two parts, like first names and last names. The first name of an interval tells us its type or character. The second name of an interval tells us the distance between the two notes. Let's focus first on how to identify the distance between two notes. Here we have a staff with a C and an E. To figure out the distance between the two intervals, I label the bottom note, in this case C, as 1. Then I count up each space and line until I get to E. There's my space. And here's my line. Now I find myself on E. Now that I've counted the lines and spaces on the music staff, I know the distance between C and E is a third. I can do this anywhere else on the music staff. For example, I can look at G and D. I label the bottom note G as 1. Then I count up each line and space until I get to D. Now that I've counted the lines and spaces on the music staff, I know the distance between G and D is a fifth. Let's go back to C and see if we can figure out all the distances between C and the other notes in the C major scale. The first relationship is between C and itself. You might think that we would call this a first, but the relationship between a note and itself gets a special name. It's called a unison. Next is C and D. If I label C 1 and count up from the C ledger line to D on the next space, I get 2, which means the relationship between C and D is a second. We've already looked at C and E, so we know that's a third. Between C and F, we have a fourth. I can continue this process for all the notes in the C major scale. Remember how there's a special name for C and itself? Well, there's also a special name for the relationship between a low C and a high C. Anytime the musical alphabet repeats and you get an interval where the high note and the low note have the same name, we call it an octave. Well, that covers an interval's last name, which tells me the distance. But what about an interval's first name? Remember, an interval's first name tells us its type or character, much like our first name tells us apart from other members of our family. There are 5 main types of interval. They are perfect, major, minor, augmented, and diminished. To say an interval's full name, I'd have to say something like major third to show both its type and distance. Right now, we will only focus on the intervals between C and the other notes in the C major scale. Once we know that information, we can use it on any major scale. Doesn't matter where you start, on the keyboard or on the staff. The only 2 types of intervals between C and the other notes in the C major scale are perfect and major. For now, we don't need to worry why interval types are called what they're called. Let's start with the perfect intervals. The unison, the fourth, the fifth, and the octave are all perfect intervals. They sound like this. Here's a unison. Here's the fourth, the fifth, and lastly, the octave. One of the properties of perfect intervals is that they have an almost hollow sound. The notes fit really well together and they don't rub against each other very much. That gives them the hollow property. The remaining intervals, the second, third, sixth, and seventh, are all major. Well, that makes sense since we're looking at a major scale. Here's what a major second sounds like. A major third. A major sixth. And a major seventh. As you can hear, those don't sound quite as hollow as the perfect intervals. And in fact, for the second and seventh, it's almost as if the two notes are rubbing against each other. No more hollow sound. Here's your challenge. Can you figure out the intervals in the G major scale?